Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you might be. My name is Kevin Michael Grace, and this is the KMG show for Monday, July the 11th, 2022. I remember reading Jim Kunstler, quite a few years ago, where he talked at length about the solar power rig that he had put on his property. And now, I guess about a decade later, we have an update. Today's column, it's not working. This summer's weather is perfect now in the Hudson Valley. Warm, sunny days for primping the garden and cool nights that invite deep sleep. Zucchini and cukes are coming on along with currants, gooseberries, blueberries. Unseen underground, the potatoes swell. The chickens range happily over their daily smorgasbord of bugs. At midnight, fireflies blink in the orchard. On the human side, though, commerce, culture, and politics, nothing works, at least not here in America. The solar electric I installed on the house 9 years ago is down. It's supposed to feed that monster called the grid. Since April, I noticed that the electric bill is creeping up way beyond the usual $17 that the electric company charges home solar producers for the privilege of feeding their system, which, let's face it, has a downside for them because of the intermittency of so-called alt energy, which disorders their operations. It's counterintuitive. Many people, I'm sure, assume that the more solar units feeding the grid, the better. Strangely, not so. Electric companies work much better when the production and flow of current is absolutely predictable and under their control. Like when they decide to fire up the nat gas on generator number 3 or tune down the hydro turbines. It's much harder to run the system with little dribs and drabs of electricity trickling in from hither and yon. But alt energy is good PR for the government, so they do whatever they can to promote or even compel its use. I got a whopping folio of tax breaks and subsidies from the state and federal government when I decided to put solar electric on my house in 2013, though it finally cost a lot, around $35,000. I had intimations of living through a chaotic period of history, and the decision was consistent with my general theory of history, which is that things happen because they seem like a good idea at the time. Getting a home solar electric rig seemed like a good idea. Kunstler continues. So last week, after considerable hassle with my solar company setting up an appointment for a techie to visit and evaluate the problem here, the guy came up at $150 an hour and informed me that my charge controller was shot. The charge controller processes all those chaotic watts coming from the solar panels on the roof into an orderly parade of electrons. He also told me that my backup batteries for running critical loads like the well pump during grid outages were at the end of their design life. Subtext, you have to get new batteries. There are 4 big ones in a cabinet under the blown charge controller and the inverter for turning direct current into alternating current that is the standard for running things. The techie had some bad news, though. New building codes forbid his company from replacing the kind of batteries I have, which are standard seal cell lead acid batteries. Some bullshit about off-gassing flammable fumes. Now the government requires lithium batteries, which would cost me $16,000 more to replace than new lead acid batteries. Now, it's theoretically possible for me to replace the less expensive lead acid batteries. They're still manufactured and sold, but the catch is I'm on my own getting them and installing them. I'm in the middle of that learning curve right now. These particular batteries cost about $850 each for the 4 of them, plus a hefty charge for drop shipping about 300 pounds of lead and plastic. I will almost certainly go that way, though. A new charge controller will run about $2,000. Altogether, replacing these components represents a big chunk of change. At the risk of sounding like some kind of pussy, Kunstler continues, I confess that this whole business of repairing my solar electric system has put me in a welter of anxiety and fury. I am trapped in the cage of sunk costs, aka the psychology of previous investment. Not only do I have $35,000 in higher value 2013 dollars tied up in all this equipment, the solar panels themselves, the wall of electronic devices, the conduit control panels, and digital readouts, but now I have to dump thousands more into it after only 9 years. It pisses me off because I should have known better. I walked with eyes wide shut into the pit of techno narcissism. The hypercomplexity of a home solar electric system is extreme. There are hundreds of little integrated components that can blow, all of it adding up to a case of guaranteed fragility. There are no easy fixes or duct tape workarounds for any of it. I can't make any replacement parts in my garage. They come from faraway factories via supply lines that get sketchier every day on trucks that don't operate profitably at $6.50 a gallon diesel fuel. In a low grade epiphany while going through this ordeal last week, I realized that back in 2013, instead of getting the solar electric system, I could have bought the Rolls Royce of home generators and buried a 500-gallon fuel tank outside the garage and had a manual water pump piggybacked onto the wall and maybe even purchased a fine wood-fired cook stove and had enough money left over for a 2-week vacation in the south of France. Silly me. Kunstler concludes, of course, these travails with my home solar electric system are a metaphor for the complexity and fragility that is, all of a sudden this year, causing the operations of Western Civ to fly to pieces. My investment in solar was as dumb as what the entire nation of Germany did in attempting to run itself on so-called green energy. Not to mention their more recent dumbass decision to forego imports of Russian nat gas in order to please the geniuses at Tony Blinken's State Department, those dumb bunnies. Of course, even when I get the solar electric back up and running again, something else is sure to go wrong. And in another 10 years, the solar panels will be at least half dead. So if you're reading this personal lamentation, consider bending toward simplicity. I wish I had. Let's take a look at the chat. Hello to Emmett Kelly's Earth. You've been in British Columbia a long time. I suppose I've been in British Columbia with a few interruptions since I was 6 years old in 1963. Hello to Ann Run, Dan Allison. Ann Run, yes, very interesting blog post indeed. Brian Frakes, hello. Hello to Head McDeck, respectable commenting name. Yo Mama says, ain't no cure for the green struggle blues. Matt Beck says, I never would have expected Kunstler to go in for the solar scam. Do you know where these solar panels come from and what they're made of? They come from China and they're made of coal. Is coal supposed to be evil? Hello to Palpcasso 88. Respectable commenting name. Says there was a period when you could get FedGov to foot most of the bill, depends on how much it lowered your bill before it died. Palpcasso 88 says, missed Friday's show because of Roger's outage. I can make outgoing calls and text, but I still can't receive them. Chogokin666 says there's got to be a German compound word for, should this be, POC weariness. Yes, okay. Hello to Quachalango. And Ren suggests lithium batteries and a new Johnson rod. Quachalango says domestic solar is okay. Palcasso 88 says, I live in the capital of a purportedly first world country, and I missed a week's worth of the KMG shows because it took 10 days to restore power in May, and now I miss another EP because Rogers. Hello to William Hicks and Pitsky. Hello to Rustin Shackelford. Except when you lived in that house in Edmonton where you were afraid for your life. Yeah, okay. Been trying to forget that. Actually, I spent 5 years in Edmonton in the 1990s. I was happy enough there at the time. Let's talk about Holland, or the Netherlands to be precise. This is from dutchnews.nl. The Netherlands may not have to reduce nitrogen compound emissions as much as currently thought, but only if it meets all its European climate change targets, according to a study by the Finance Ministry. The unpublished paper obtained by NRC says the original estimate of the extent of the cuts needed to protect designated natural areas by 2030 does not take into account the future effects of other measures to cut emissions. Currently, some provinces must reduce nitrogen emission by almost half, while around Natura 2000 nature reserves emissions have to be cut by 95%. that would require up to 1/3 of farmers to give up their business. Dutch farmers have been protesting against the government plans for forced buyouts for the last week, disrupting traffic and blockading food distribution centers, also stealing the private jet of the Prime Minister of the Netherlands, Mark Rutte. If the Netherlands manages to comply with European targets to cut pollution from traffic, industry, aviation, and construction, the reductions faced by farmers could be brought back to between a quarter and half of what they are now, the paper said. What's the big plan here in the Netherlands? Well, I happened to run across this almost 5-year-old article from Dutch News. Dutch investors launch new marketing program for the Netherlands, Tri-State City. A group of institutional investors in the Netherlands have joined forces to present the Netherlands plus parts of Belgium and Germany as a single city network named Tri-State City. The project, backed by Dutch employers organization VNO-NCW, says the region's population of 30 million people creates a sustainable urban powerhouse. The project supporters include property developers Ho and pension funds, as well as Utrecht's Economic Board. Dutch cities, the organization says, are too small to compete in what it calls the battle of the cities, in which megacities compete for investment and talent. By treating the Netherlands as an urbanized delta with 17 million inhabitants, the project supporters say that they are creating a very strong player in this battle of the titans. Our city marketing is too fragmented and inefficient, the project website says. In practice, the Dutch cities compete with each other abroad. Amsterdam Metropool, Brainport Eindhoven, Twente Stad, Ede Food Valley, Reggio Groningen Assen, and Derry Delta are just some of the names Dutch regions use when marketing themselves abroad. The Netherlands must present itself as one of the most powerful and sustainable city networks in the world, the project backers say. It's about how Dutch companies present themselves to companies such as Apple or big Chinese firms. Prologis Benelux director Bram Verhoeven told the Financial Dagblad. So this is the plan. Farming is going to be eliminated in the Netherlands, and the whole country is going to be paved over and turned into a Bugman dystopia, doubtless to be filled up with migrants from Africa and the Middle East. Doesn't that sound delightful? Here's a piece from Sundance at the Last Refuge, aka the Conservative Treehouse. Despite the US media not giving any time, attention, or discussion to the rise of farmer protests in Europe, everyone should pay attention because the same climate change goals being enforced in the European Union are coming to North America. The global food manipulators within the World Economic Forum have established a farming policy that aligns with their climate change goals. As noted in this Sky News discussion, this is the Great Reset. It's not just Netherlands Prime Minister Mark Rutte pushing the agenda. In 2020, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau gave an identical outline with an identical timeline for the exact same process. The collective WEF political leaders are all singing from the same hymnal. In this discussion and interview segment, the spokesperson for Netherlands Agricultural and Horticultural Organization, Witse Sonema, outlines why there is such a broad sense of frustration, anger, even despair amongst farmers amid proposals for nitrogen reduction target plans. This will be coming to North America soon. Well, if the Netherlands is the second biggest food exporter in the world, and they're going to be eliminating farming in the Netherlands, then this is going to be a problem for the world. Is it not? You don't need to be a farmer to understand that nitrogen phosphorus-based industrial fertilizer has been the reason why farm yields have generated massive amounts of food on a global basis. The United States, UK, and places like the Netherlands have massively increased their ability to generate food for export, in large part due to the success of improved fertilizer and crop-saving modern pesticides. It is a simple matter of math that if North American and European farmers are forced by climate policy to reduce their food production, there will be a shortage of food. There will be a significant gap between the food needed and the new climate driven limits on commercial food production. This intentional curtailing of food production that creates the purposeful shortage of food is where Bill Gates, the WEF, and the synthetic meat and bugs for food advocates enter the picture. It appears the plan is to replace the missing global calories by changing the food supply, changing what and how people eat. Lab grown, synthetic meat, nut, soy milk to replace dairy, and bugs being used as replacements for protein sources are the three approaches advocated by the climate change advocates that you are likely familiar with. However, as we saw in the pandemic response to food consumption, there is going to be a massive problem as the WEF attempts to shift food delivery within their Great Reset. Think of the United States like a massive global farm. In this context, the parallels between the US and the Netherlands are quite remarkable. Specifically, because of advancements in farming over the past 2 decades, the United States food production has increased massively. The same is true for North America as a whole, with Mexico and Canada included. Industrial farming advancements have made it possible to export billions of tons of food every year from our farms in North America to the rest of the world. The Dutch farmers are like the US farmers in their high productivity. In fact, the Netherlands is the second biggest agriculture and food exporter in the world. Even with a small population of 17 million people, the Netherlands has consistently been among the top contenders in the food export market. The reason is simple: they are good at it. Dutch farmers, like American farmers, are excellent at producing food. The Netherlands is one of the largest countries in the world when it comes to the export of agricultural goods such as meat, dairy, eggs, vegetables, and fruit. Unfortunately, this is why the climate change activists in the World Economic Forum have targeted them. The Dutch farmers do not have as good a political shield as the US farmer have via lobbyists. The reason the Dutch farmers have more vulnerability on a political front is there are far more independent farmers who operate without the influence of large multinational agricultural corporations. And we can't have that, can we? So let's just pave over the Netherlands. Oh, and Belgium, while we're at it. This is a piece from Thomas Lifson, an American thinker. Green tyranny has finally provoked mass reactions, and the first government has fallen after imposing insane policies that wreck the food supply for its people. Both the president and the prime minister of Sri Lanka are resigning in the wake of massive mobs storming and occupying their residences, burning the PM's private house, and refusing to leave the presidential palace until both men are out of office. Sri Lanka foolishly signed on to the Green Initiative in farming, going organic and limiting the importation and use of chemical fertilizers. Food production, including tea, a vital export earner of foreign exchange, collapsed, and now the government is broke and people are hungry. The crisis there may get worse before it gets better, since there is no money to import food or fertilizer, and international aid may be less available than normal as worldwide food shortages loom. But it's not just the third world countries that are experiencing mass revolts against top-down green policies. Farmers in Holland, in open revolt against government plans to destroy their livelihoods by limiting nitrogen application for fertilizer, are tying up that country's roads and cities, and the revolt is spreading to Germany, Italy, Spain, and Poland. So with this crisis in his country, guess what Prime Minister Mark Rutte of the Netherlands decided to do? Why, visit the Ukraine, because the Ukraine is obviously far more important to us in the West than anything happening in our own countries. And another piece from American Thinker, this by J.B. Shirk. It sure seems as if another prescient verse from John Fogerty's ingenious lyrical mind is taking shape. I see a bad moon arising. I see trouble on the way. I see earthquakes and lightning. I see bad times today. Fogerty actually took his inspiration from the 1941 movie All That Money Can Buy, which tells the tale of a 19th century New Hampshire farmer who sold his soul to Satan for economic success. Tell me that's not exactly what's going on today when the World Economic Forum does Lucifer's work in exchange for the promise of its members' personal salvation. There's no denying what's barreling toward us. The Davos death cult and his great reset deal with the devil to conquer the world is unleashing hell on earth. Dutch farmers are fighting for the right to grow food in a Build Back Better world dedicated to mass starvation. The great and honorable Shinzo Abe of Japan lies slain, while the communists in China and throughout the West celebrate his assassin. George Soros and Joe Biden have declared war against conservative members of the U.S. Supreme Court for daring to weaken the Leviathan's unilateral authority to dictate how individual Americans must live. Justin Trudeau is banning firearms in Canada before his subjects gain the courage to depose his regime. The U.S. government has ceded control of the southern border to narco-terrorists and sex slavers. And in a disheartening example of how debauched crime and youth culture have become, 7 Philadelphia teens recently recorded themselves beating a 72-year-old man to death with traffic cones. The globalist project to kick up a hornet's nest in Russia's backyard in service to the US NATO rules-based international order has destroyed mineral-rich farmlands throughout much of Ukraine. While Biden kills domestic energy production and exacerbates Americans' pain at the pump, he's shipping America's strategic reserve of petroleum to our geopolitical enemies in China. At the same time that Germany is gearing up to restrict home heating and ration hot water, one left-wing minister is pushing to confiscate guns owned by members of opposing political parties. Manufacturing plants and food distribution centers are suspiciously burning down all over the world. And the island nation of Sri Lanka, whose massive public spending and Green New Deal energy policies have predictably produced untenable debt, fuel, and food shortages and runaway inflation, is now on the verge of collapse. Oh, there's definitely a bad moon rising these days. So, do you think that our elite or the members of the media are going to look at the disaster in Sri Lanka and say, we better not do that? No, that is not the conclusion that they are going to come to. What was it, 30 or 31 months ago, we learned of a new, or novel, if you will, not particularly virulent respiratory disease, which came from China. So, the elites, our leaders, the smart guys, the experts, the adults in the room decided to mule like children caught in a thunderstorm and then destroy our economies, crush society, and take away basic civil rights. Think they've learned their lesson? No, they have not. This is again from Sundance at the Last Refuge, and it's pretty funny. Texas authorities urgently beg residents to turn off air conditioning because there is no wind to power the windmills. This is not The Onion or any form of spoof. This is real life, and it is happening today. Amid a heat wave throughout most of Texas, the Texas Electric Reliability Council of Texas, or ERCOT, is urgently asking Texas residents to conserve electricity because it has projected a shortage in energy reserves Monday with no market solution available. Voluntary conservation is needed between 2 p.m. and 8 p.m. Monday. The problem, as the Texas Power Authorities have identified it, is outlined via NBC News. According to ERCOT, factors driving the need for this important action by customers, record high electric demand, the heat wave that has settled on Texas and most of the central United States is driving increased electric use. Other grid operators are operating under similar conservative operations programs as ERCOT due to the heat wave. Low wind. While solar power is generally reaching near full generation capacity, wind generation is currently generating significantly less than what it historically generated in this time period. Current projections show wind generation coming in less than 10% of its capacity. Conservation notifications are issued when projected reserves may fall below 2,300 megawatts for 30 minutes or more. President Donald Trump jokes about windmills in speech on energy. All of a sudden it stops. The wind and the televisions go off, and your wives and husbands say, "Darling, I want to watch Donald Trump on television tonight," but the wind stopped blowing. And, well, windmills, they're horrible. They're excrescences on the landscape and now the ocean, and they are bird abattoirs, and they don't work. Oh, if it gets, you don't want it to get too windy, they have to shut it off. They have to shut the windmills off, because if it gets too windy, the windmills burst into fire or explode. How's that green energy thing working out for us? And they must be very worried in Germany. This is from Paul Joseph Watson at Summit News. Cities across Germany are planning to use sports arenas and exhibition halls as warm-up spaces this winter to help freezing citizens who are unable to afford skyrocketing energy costs. Bild newspaper reveals how the nation's Cities and Municipalities Association has urged local authorities to set aside public spaces to help vulnerable citizens in the colder months. Germany has already seen its gas supply from Russia significantly restricted as a result of its support for sanctions and the war on Ukraine. We are currently preparing for all emergency scenarios for autumn and winter. Jutta Steinruck, the city mayor of Ludwigshafen, told Bild, where the Friedrich Ebert Halle Arena is about to be converted into a warm-up hall. I'm beginning to wonder, are these going to be permanent living spaces for Germans? They'll give you a little cot. Nobody can say exactly how dramatic the developments will be, said Gerd Landsberg, the head of the Cities and Municipalities Association. Landberg urged local municipalities to create heat islands and warm rooms where people can stay, even during a very cold winter. The western German town of Neustadt, Frankenthal, and Landau are also making similar arrangements, while others are planning to turn off lights outside public buildings, as well as deactivating traffic lights at night to save energy. As we highlighted last week, Germany's largest residential landlord, which owns around 490,000 properties, is set to impose energy rationing that will cut heating to tenants at night in response to falling gas imports from Russia. Germans have also been told to take fewer showers, wear more layers of clothing, and avoid washing their clothes and driving their cars as often. Polls show that Germans are increasingly dissatisfied at their living standards being reduced as a result of the energy crisis caused by Western support for Ukraine. Many of them are attempting to panic buy stoves and firewood, with supplies in many areas of the country now exhausted until next year. Well, I can speak from personal experience about trying to heat a house, or at least part of it, with a roaring fire in a traditional fireplace, that it becomes intolerably hot near the fireplace, but freezing on the same level because of all of the wind that is sucked in, the air that is sucked in to feed the fire. And let's take a look at antiwar.com. Yes, Ukrainian Russian forces use human shields. I'll have more on that in a minute. Ukrainian soldiers train in Britain as war with Russia rages on. U.S.-Russia trade blame for diplomatic freeze. G20 diplomats failed to reach consensus on Ukraine war. Zelensky sacks Ukraine's envoy to Germany. Other ambassadors. Well, that's pretty much a personal dictatorship there in the Ukraine, isn't it? And speaking of the Ukraine, this is from moonofalabama.org. New York Times ground report debunks New York Times claim of strikes against Ukraine's civilians. Nearly all big mainstream media currently provide live updates of the war in Ukraine. These include abbreviated reports about this or that incident. They are convenient for the reader, but miss important details which often debunk the claims made in them. In today's live updates, the Washington Post writes twice about a missile strike in the town of Chasiv Yar. 24 people remain trapped under the rubble of two high-rise apartment buildings in Chasiv Yar, a city in the Donetsk region that local officials said were struck by Russian missiles. The governor of Donetsk called Russian strikes on the region over the weekend true hell. The Saturday missile strike was also mentioned in yesterday's WAPO live updates in similar detail. I find no standalone report on the strike on the WAPO website. The New York Times live updates also mention the strike. Further down, the incident is described in more detail. The Times, however, has a reporter, Carlotta Gall, in Ukraine, who visited the town, and down in her standalone report, we find important details that the summaries somehow missed. And what is the gist of this? Human shields. To call this a strike on civilians is incorrect, to say the least. It was a strike on a military target that unfortunately had used a civilian residential structure, with the residents becoming human shields and later collateral damage. I found it a pretty good rule that when the Ukraine accuses Russia of something, that means they are doing it themselves. And again, from Sundance at The Last Refuge, a quietly released study from the UN Human Rights Commissioner looking into allegations of war crimes conducted during the Ukraine versus Russia conflict specifically looked into allegations of Russian military targeting a nursing home facility in the eastern region of Luhansk. What the UN investigation revealed was that Ukraine military forces had intentionally used the nursing home as an active base to launch military strikes against Russian forces. The Associated Press was forced to reveal, quote, Ukraine's armed forces bear a large and perhaps equal share of the blame for what happened in Staria Krasnyanka, which is about 360 miles southeast of Kyiv. A few days before the attack, Ukrainian soldiers took up positions inside the nursing home, effectively making the building a target. This is what they call a war crime. Is it not? Let's go back to the chat. Ruslan Akhmatov says a nice neighborhood surveillance group composed of Albanians, Chechens, and Berbers would keep the Bawas in check nicely. Hello, Dionysus. Head McNeck says, I have a sense of foreboding. Flying to the UK tomorrow for a trip I planned for months feels like a foolish time, but there's nothing for it. Well, golly, I feel for you here, because the stories I've been reading in the Daily Mail and elsewhere about what's been going on in Heathrow, pretty bad. Hello to Laird Gordon McDoodle. Wasn't it last year when some youth Facebook Live their torturing of some retarded man or child, says Anrun. Dr. Deadname says, get them coal plants going, Germany. The problem they're experiencing is that I've been, okay, not going to repeat that. Every home should have a fireplace, says Yo Mama. Emma Kelly's Earth says, belated implementation of the Morgenthau Plan in Germany. Beating an elderly black passerby to death with a traffic cone while filming it and laughing is really a new level of depravity. Dan says, and they must bury the wind blades as they aren't recyclable. Emmett Kelly's Earth says, Sri Lanka reminds me of Patrick Henry saying, Caesar had his Brutus, Charles I his Cromwell, and George III may profit by their example. If this be treason, make the most of us. Chokakin 666 asks whether the Tamil Tigers will return. I don't know. Aren't they all in Canada now as refugees? Half Galician, hello, says take a 10-week holiday, but don't think you will compete with Americans or Asians. Do we have anyone else here? Dear Nederlanders, I suggest the Sri Lankan solution, says Brian Frakes. When did Western Europeans lose the will to live, asks Emmett Kelly's Earth. Well, I'll have more on this a little later. Che Blutarski, hello, it says, Bugman Dystopia is a great name for a band. I caught the end of Bonnie and Clyde the other night. Fate Dunaway was quite lovely, says Paul Casso 88. That movie was considered shocking when it came out, not just because of the violence, because of the glamorization of two depraved criminals. Very romantic, you know. Still talking about Smile. Melanie Griffith. She became rather annoying as an adult actress. Not quite as annoying as Meg Ryan, Manic Pixie Dream Girl. The critic Nathan Rabin came up with this phrase, Manic Pixie Dream Girl, and then a few years ago he apologized for it because it made some women unhappy. Emmett Till's father was executed for raping and killing Italian women villagers during World War II, says Ruslan Aklamov. Yes, KMG, what should the government do about Rogers? I suppose some people are suggesting that, American companies be allowed to enter the telecom space in Canada. I'm not really in favor of that. What happens is that, Rogers and companies like them, they just buy up every competitor. They just swallow them up. And of course, the Canadian government is talking tough about Rogers. Rogers is literally too big to fail. Yes, maybe Melanie got brain damage from being scalped on the set of Roar. Oh, Tippi Hedren says these terribly mean things about her treatment by Alfred Hitchcock. Tippi Hedren thought that lions made good house pets. Yeah, that's not crazy at all. And, I just want to talk briefly about this bodega killing in New York City. This is from Andrea Cavalier at the Daily Mail. I don't want no trouble. New footage shows how New York City bodega worker who stabbed gangster to death in self-defense tried to defuse argument over $3. And I see that the mayor has visited that bodega to show his support for the owner. And yeah, you see, if the mayor is visiting a bodega like that, you see how bad the situation is for him. That, I don't know, is this going to be a return to the 1970s and 1980s? Mayor Eric Adams said, I'm a person that's there for people following the law. I saw him from the video. I saw a voter here inside the store following the law. It's time for New Yorkers and Americans to start standing up for people who follow the law. He's not the best speaker, Eric Adams. At a hearing Thursday, prosecutors from Manhattan DA Alvin Bragg's office moved to lower Alba's bond from $250,000 to $50,000. He was only required to post $5,000, 10%, which was paid by his family and boss. Alba is barred from leaving New York City and had to surrender his passport, which means he will not be able to go on a previously planned trip to the Dominican Republic. I don't know. Perhaps he'd be safer in the Dominican Republic than in New York City. I mentioned the 72-year-old black man who was beaten to death by 7 teenagers who thought it was absolutely hilarious and filmed themselves doing it. Now, how long can the media, the MSN, maintain that this is not a story? How many years has it been already? This is from Nicarama at Red State. 4chan users claim to have cracked the password for a backup of Hunter Biden's iPhone, and then were also able to access an iPad that he used. They also claim to have accessed iCloud Notes. The password was alleged to be a woman's name with an age after it. They announced that they had 400 gigabytes of data and then began leaking some of the information onto 4chan. Among the things that they leaked onto the site that I was able to view were what appeared to be Hunter Biden's passport and part of a Visa card, various pictures of Hunter and Joe Biden, and phone numbers allegedly linked to multiple members of the Biden family, videos of a sexual nature, including his niece, Hunter Biden's niece, underage niece, and alleged porn searches on the iPad contacts and conversations. There was also an indication of conversations tagged with the name Pedo Peter. It was not clear who Pedo Peter is referencing. There were a variety of conversations that were accessed that appeared to be conversations between various members of the Biden family. There were claims that they had other records, such as tax and bank accounts, linked to Joe Biden, but I did not immediately see any links to those records. 4chan users said they were still rooting through all the information and would be dropping more. It's not clear what the provenance of this is, and we have not been able to verify whether it is legitimate, although things like the pictures and the passport would seem to indicate that it's real. Based on what we understand about Hunter, it's not clear if it's related to the infamous laptop, which has been verified by a number of outlets and upon which we have reported at great length, including Hunter's time in a sensory deprivation tank and texts about how he feels about his stepmother. Spoiler alert, he hates her guts. And this is from the Daily Mail. Josh Boswell warning graphic content. Hunter Biden could face prostitution charges for transporting hookers across state lines and disguising checks to them as payments for medical services. The first son spent $30,000 in 5 months on the girlfriend experience. Hunter wrote checks to a Ukrainian woman called Ekaterina Moreva, who was named in red flag reports by banks for suspicious activities, documents reveal. A suspicious activity report filed by JP Morgan Chase flagged transactions involving Moreva after she received tens of thousands of dollars from Hunter's company. Photos from Hunter's iPhone show he wrote checks disguised as medical services to prostitutes supplied by Moreva, whose website offers a girlfriend experience. Videos and pictures show Hunter helping transport these women from Boston to New York for a debauched night with him, a potential federal offense. I believe it's called the Mann Act. That's what got Chuck Berry thrown into prison. Boy, Hunter Biden sure liked taking pictures and videos of himself naked. He sure liked to do that. And there's some very bad stuff in a lot of these pictures. Very, very bad stuff. Oh, and it gets worse. Exclusive this is again from the Daily Mail, Josh Boswell. Hunter Biden addressed his white lawyer as a N-word multiple times, used phrases like true dat N-word, and bantered, I only love you because you're black, in shocking texts unearthed days after Joe's emotional Tulsa speech decrying racism. This is the worst that they've got on Hunter Biden? Worse than the whoring and transporting women over state lines for sex, and the incest. That's the worst. The N-word. This is from Kane at Citizen Free Press. Hunter Biden video nightmare weighing crack cocaine. Yes, he got into a dispute with a prostitute over how much crack cocaine he had. So he weighed it in front of her. And here's another video of Hunter Biden on the beach having a nervous breakdown. Hunter Biden has his dad's flight jacket from USS Ronald Reagan when Joe Biden received it from the skipper during a visit as VP. Yes, arguing with a hooker. Yes, this photo of Hunter Biden on a FaceTime call with a call girl tied up and a bag over her head as he eats a sandwich should give you an idea of the magnitude. But of course, this has nothing to do. It's not a political story because he's the president's son and no more. Dad has been dragged into this on many occasions from what we've seen from the laptop. And so President Obama's point man in the Ukraine was VP Joe Biden. So his son hoovers up a ton of money for a no-show job on the board of Bureaucracy in the Ukraine. And that's not a conflict of interest. Not a bit. Not a bit. Hunter sleeping in the same bed with Natalie Biden. uh, what the Russians have this word, what do they call it? Compromat? How much compromat do the Russians, the Chinese, etc., have on Joe Biden? But of course, if no one's going to hear about this except from specialized sites, like Citizen Free Press, then maybe everyone will get to pretend that none of this happened. Political implications. This is from Miranda Devine at the New York Post. It took a certain bloodless chutzpah for the president to place his scandal-ridden son front and center at a White House function last week. Hunter Biden, 52, popped up at Thursday's Medal of Freedom ceremony to glad hand a network from his front row perch, even as he awaits indictment by a grand jury in Delaware over his shady foreign business dealings, most lucratively in China. Just one day earlier, FBI Director Christopher Wray and his British MI5 counterpart made a rare joint public appearance in London to sound the alarm over the growing serious security and economic threat posed by China, which aims to steal our intellectual property and corrupt our politics. Also on Wednesday, U.S. counterintelligence officials issued a bulletin to state and local officials warning of an escalating campaign by China to manipulate and influence politicians to push Washington for China-friendly policies. The threat is not exactly new. The Trump administration pursued aggressive measures to rein in China's growing assertiveness and espionage activities, yet Joe Biden has gone soft on China since becoming president. He diverted at least 1 million barrels of oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to Chinese state-owned gas giant Sinopec, which Hunter Biden had invested in through his 10% stake in Chinese private equity firm BHR. Joe Biden disbanded the China Initiative, a national security program set up by the Trump administration to combat China's economic espionage at universities and research institutions. Joe Biden revoked Trump-era restrictions against TikTok, instead promising a national security review, which has led to no action for over a year. The world's fastest-growing social media platform, owned by Chinese company ByteDance, has repeatedly accessed U.S. users' private personal data. In another unwinding of hardline Trump policies, the Biden administration granted the Chinese tech giants Huawei a license to purchase chips used in automobile manufacturing. Joe Biden has not pressed China on the origins of COVID-19. He suspended tariffs on Chinese solar panels, and Biden is reportedly contemplating lifting further Trump tariffs against Chinese imports for no discernible benefit to America, with economists warning that any effect on soaring inflation would be minimal and short-lived. And yes, Monica Showalter at the American Thinker asks the big question, what's it going to take for Hunter Biden's pervy corrupt doings to matter? It probably shouldn't surprise anyone that denizens of the 4chan anonymous bulletin board claim to have hacked into Hunter Biden's cell phone cloud account and are busy posting its pervy pictures. Having looked at this stuff, which is all over Twitter, I agree with the Washington Examiner. The skepticism about what's being spread around now is in order, given that it could have come from Hunter's laptop. I didn't see any really recent well into Joe Biden presidential term material from the past 2 years on the dates I could determine. It is mostly a chronicle of Hunter Biden's narcissistic and perverted lifestyle during the 2017 to 2019 years. And some of this stuff I can't repeat. Oh, yes, posing with underage consorts and taking inappropriate pictures with his young female relatives in bed. Gross, just gross, and you can't unsee them. All the same, there appears to be something to the phone hack that many very recent purported phone messages were screenshotted and spread around. Does anyone want to speculate why Hunter Biden was conversing with someone nicknamed Peter? But news is coming out about this pervy stuff and Hunter Biden's business dealings with America's enemies, such as China, having an impact. Hunter, recall, is Joe Biden's closest advisor. He earns as much as $500,000 a pop for his paintings, which even top gallery artists don't pull in, and nobody's allowed to know who his buyers are. He hasn't dumped his China holdings, yet has admitted that he's dealing with top Chinese spies in some of his previously disclosed laptop disclosures. He is clearly unstable, engages in illegal drug and gun activity, has been in trouble for tax evasion, owes money to hookers and strippers throughout the narrative, and takes big payments from the world's gamiest regimes who would have to know all his secrets here. But of course, nothing to see here, folks. Move along. Ruslan Akhmatov says, I miss Don Imus too. When I was at Kogo in San Diego, we carried Don Imus's show. So, I heard quite a bit of it. I thought he was a pretty funny man. I like the parodies that he did. Hello to Gamion, who says, I can't watch, just jumping in to say hi, can't watch the stream today, but with y'all in spirit. Who else do we have here? They're untouchable, says Ruslan Akhmatov. Pretty sure I don't believe the niece pregnancy rumor because they would have aborted it, says Che Blutarski. Okay, the Hunter stuff is ultra suspect, might be an op. To what gain? I have no idea. I don't think so, because you see, who they want to get rid of is Kamala Harris. They need to get rid of her first, because if Joe Biden goes down, then Kamala becomes president, and she's hated even more than Joe Biden is. So you got to get someone trustable into the position of VP, then take down Joe Biden. Respectable commenting name says KMG's use of the phrase incest to refer to Hunter's Irish marriage tendencies is a clever workaround to comment on his creepy relationship with his daughter niece. Owning a pit bull, almost always a big red flag, says my trail of disgrace. So many great breeds of dogs. Why do people want a horrible one? Because they want people to be afraid of them. Bill Burr said in one of his comedy routines, he has a pit bull. He said something like, I never understand when black people complain that white people will cross the road to avoid passing them on the sidewalk. He says, people do that to me when I'm out walking my pit bull, and it makes me feel like the king of the world. I've read that Borzoi have killed pit bulls, says Justin Proto. Something to consider. Jay Blutarski says Ezra Pound was jailed with Louis Till before he was executed. Called him St. Louis Till. And let's see. What are we going to talk about now? Oh, another celebrity gets the corona doom. This is from Breaking 911 yesterday. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer tests positive for COVID. Spokesman says he greatly appreciates the protection the vaccine has provided him. They all say this. They also, oh yeah, well, since I had the vaccine, since I've been jabbed 3, 4, 5 times, and you still got it. Oh, it's very minor, very minor. Oh, you mean like Dr. Fauci being sidelined for 4 weeks? That does not sound minor to me. And congratulations to Novak Djokovic for winning his 4th straight Wimbledon title. But he is not allowed to play at the U.S. Open because of his vaccine status. John McEnroe comments, these politicians are getting their way too much. They did in Australia. Let the guy come in and play in the U.S. I mean, come on. This is ridiculous. And COVID fanatics. There's a lot of them in my country. I just, whenever I go outside, just the number of young people that I see, often walking alone, wearing masks, outdoors. I'll ask again, do they have any idea how vast the atmosphere is? This is from CPV Ottawa. Ottawa health officials recommend using masks even at outdoor festivals like Blues Fest. And, oh, yes, there's a Emerald Robinson, who's a lovely woman. She mentioned some months ago that Fox News and Newsmax took Biden money to push deadly COVID vaccines to its viewers. Yes, and it would appear that they tailored their commentary at these networks to be highly favorable to the vaccines, such that sweet, sweet government money would keep coming in. Let's take a look and see if there's anything new at Alex Berenson's Substack. He has this is from yesterday, The Pandemic's Wrongest Man, an occasional series. That's what he's been called. He quotes from The Economist, July the 9th, 2022. The new data suggests that the damage from shutting down schools has been worse than almost anyone expected. COVID learning loss has been a global disaster. Berenson had tweeted on April the 10th, 2020, yes, 2020, I will try to analyze dispassionately, but I will admit I am angry about the way we have largely ignored the massive harm lockdowns and school closings have on kids. Remember, anyone under 30 is at almost zero risk here. There are always outliers. Planes crash, but flying is safe. Children, more than anyone else, suffer immediately from the lockdowns. They're denied school. They're denied normal socializing with their friends. In many cases, they have even bizarrely been denied the chance to play outside. Well, it was for their own good. You can never be too careful. Let's go to Eugippius, who is extrapolating on his hypothesis of downward pressure, the political power being wielded by many, 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 many more people. He has an essay called Government by Vampire Zombie Squid. As a friend writes, our system is very opaque. Various thinkers have tried to diagram or schematicize the relationships among different branches of Western liberal democratic regimes. A popular concept in some circles, and the prototype for many such efforts is Curtis Yarvin's Cathedral. I am not going to talk about Curtis Yarvin's ridiculous post about hobbits and elves and people just wanting to grill. No, I'm not. Eugippius continues, what ties together much of this analysis is the conviction that formal political structures have been increasingly sidelined by informal, illegible, and corrupt power networks. We see a growing gulf between how Western liberal democracies claim to function and how they actually behave. Attempts to model power structures like these are at base arguments about whether regime behavior is emergent or centrally directed, whether our governments are simply failing or pursuing hidden goals, and whether our elites are malicious or just remarkably stupid, or some unfortunate mixture of both. Instead of contributing more schemata to the landscape of dissident thought on what is wrong with modern liberal democracy, I'll take a descriptive approach. It seems to me that not only our pandemic response, but many signature Western policies are distinguished by a curious set of recurring pathologies. Taken together, these suggest important conclusions about how we're governed. As I see it, our brave new world is beset by state actions which betray 1, properties of inertia, 2, the absence of strategy, 3, symptoms of profound demobilization, 4, an obsession with simple metrics, 5, diffuse consensus guidance, 6, transnational uniformity, and 7, media activism. Inertia. There is always a period of time, whether weeks or months, where energy builds. The lockdowners demand lockdowns, the vaccinators demand vaccines. Then the policies descend, and as they continue across a parabolic arc of enthusiasm, ultimately burning out at some indeterminate future point. While the policies are in motion, it's very difficult to stop them. Even if they become counterproductive or obviously inadvisable, they'll continue on their course. Contrary evidence might slightly hasten their demise or rob them of a little momentum, but there will be no sudden reversal or redirection. Absence of strategy. Regime actions betray no hints of even moderately sophisticated planning or strategy to achieve well-defined goals. There is rather the blunt insistence upon and pursuit of simplistic, often utopian aspirations accompanied by glaring strategic errors. Initially, corona infection statistics were published to incentivize the population to comply with lockdowns. But then the statistics did nothing so much as reveal that lockdowns don't work very well. The same thing happened with vaccine efficacy statistics, which were originally collected to prove the miracle of the mRNA elixirs and shame the unvaccinated, and which rapidly became a monumental own goal, as the vaccinated quickly developed higher rates of infection. If the vaccinators had pursued more sophisticated messaging strategies and positive incentives, they could have possibly managed to vaccinate far more people than they succeeded in vaccinating. Instead, they resorted to blunt mandates and conjured political opposition out of nowhere. The seasonal nature and age stratified risk of SARS 2 likewise suggests many strategic options, none of which any Western liberal democracy ever pursued. Demobilization. Related to both of the foregoing is the increasing inability of the regime to marshal special resources or rearrange its routine to further any specific initiative. A key element of lockdowns, at least at the level of theory, is centralized quarantine for the infected. Establishing these facilities obviously requires no few resources and no little planning. Few Western governments ever bothered. They confined themselves instead to cheap and easy prohibitions. When the vaccinators finally arrived on stage, most governments had substantial difficulties obtaining the vaccines and getting them into the arms of their subjects, even though in 2021, it is no exaggeration to say that mass vaccination had become the highest goal of Western liberal democracies everywhere. Eugippius concludes simplicity. As with environmentalism and corona and many other matters, there is the ever recurring tendency to reduce broad, difficult problems that admit of multiple solutions to a single one dimensional number. Whether it is carbon emissions, vaccination rates, or infection statistics, policies are inevitably drawn into the vortex of a narrow numerical focus. Similar tendencies have long been visible in economic policy. Diffusion. The origins of preferred regime policies can be very hard to trace, and they enjoy a wide, diffuse support throughout the institutional and political arm. Nor is it easy to determine from which offices or people particular energy for these policies emanates, and where the directors of these policies might be. Regimes will often provide public faces for specific initiatives, such as the corona SARS, who on further examination appear to have starkly limited influence or to be mere figureheads for a broader consensus. Transnational uniformity. My conspiratorial critics call this the suspicious lockstep nature of corona response, but it's merely a higher order diffusion operating not within the institutional apparatus of a given country, but among the institutions of most Western democracies. The relatively similar political behavior of our states has been observed for a very long time. From automobile safety regulations to cigarette taxes, it's true that Western nations act in very similar ways. It's probably also true that the more pathological their policies, the more uniformity we'll see with respect to these policies across governments. Media activism. Central to all late regime policies is the role of the press, not as mere reporter or even advocate, but as a primary political actor. They don't so much persuade as portray to media consumers an edited version of reality in which the preferred regime policies are justifiable and legible. Their role is analogous to that of political police like the Stasi and Warsaw Pact socialist regimes, except that they operate via positive rather than negative persuasion. If the DDR had decided to lock down, state security services would have enforced it. But in the Democratic Federal Republic of Germany, it is rather the media who terrifies everyone into staying home. Eugippius continues, now, the objection to all of this is that I've carefully constructed my list to yield the conclusion that I am building to. That's fair, but I'd rather say that it is pathologies like these which lead me to my broader arguments about the importance of the bureaucratic machinery for the operation of modern states. Thousands and thousands of people contribute in their own little ways to regime policies which cannot be implemented without the cooperation of the institutional machinery or those tentacles via which the monstrosity interacts with the world. A lot of the internal processes of these organizations are devoted to the propagation or diffusion of the same ideas across thousands of different offices and organizations. Thus, policies acquire an inertia as more and more actors buy into them and further these policies in their own small ways. It is very hard to sell many people at once on complicated ideas, And so there is inevitably an emphasis on simplicity and an absence of strategy. The ideal policy in this environment will be one where more of a given action is good and demanded, and less of a given action is bad and to be abhorred. The increasing demobilization of our governments, apparent especially since 2011, arises from the wide distribution of actors and the incredible difficulty of getting what are thousands of people to act in concert towards any goal, even one in which they deeply believe. Media activism plays an important role here, for the institutional actors aren't immune to press propaganda any more than are the we rabble, and consensus propagation doesn't stop at international borders. In fact, transnational uniformity is especially desirable as it shields individual bureaucrats from accountability, and it's precisely these kinds of transnationally diffused policies that have the greatest chance of winning deep domestic support, particularly among an elite and a sub-elite that consider themselves international cosmopolitans. Eugippius concludes, I've written before that this crucial diffusion of power downwards out of the political arm and ever deeper into the ranks of the bureaucracy, the media, and even academia amounts to a kind of political decay. It is still ongoing. Corona, which in many ways represents a coup for the middle bureaucratic ranks, has accelerated these processes. More and more, our states will act in these bizarre ways, crashing through the world like lifeless zombies. Yet the very downward diffusion of power that causes their sickness paradoxically makes them incredibly powerful. It means that all government actions are backed by a widely distributed consensus in which everyone participates, from hospital doctors to elementary school teachers to the police. And you could find this at eugippius.com. I wanted to read an essay now by Frank Wright. It's from a week ago. Keep in mind that this is before Boris Johnson's resignation. It's called A New World Disorder, Part 3 in a series on Bonapartism, the collapse of the extreme center. These powers and the institutions which wield them used to belong to us. The strange orthodoxies of managerial bureaucracy are supplanting the customs and traditions which made us who we are. It is a curious feature of the identitarian craze that it results in the elision of identity in groups and its abolition in nations. Factionalism makes tropes of people, which is the result of the grievance taxonomies into which centrism manages its convulsing populations. Anything that speaks of the before time, of the past we all used to share and which filled our lives and entertainment, has been marginalized. It is a devastating cultural revolution prosecuted by the heirs of Roy Jenkins and Lyndon Johnson, to whose politics some kindly refer to as paternalism. These are bad fathers, and they have sired a host of enemies. For a year, the world was treated to the spectacle of lawless mobs burning and looting American cities. This fiery, but mostly peaceful protest has not only been wiped from media memory, but transmuted into a painful cry for justice. Quickly monetized by charlatans who disappeared with the takings, Black Lives Matter was a criminal enterprise from start to finish, being the lucrative exploitation of one felon's sanctification in an act of crime. It has been glorified as an enterprise beyond criticism, for which the England football team still kneels. BLM is an exemplar of the detached signifier of the advertising age. It is a sign that does not point to the reality of itself, but to a fantasy. The distance between reality and fantasy is commonly unmentionable with so many totems of the regime, because to contradict these disposable consumer legends with an accurate account of the reality is to cause a tremendous shock. It is a plot too obscene even for Jean Genet. It is against this larcenist frenzy of complete moral inversion that some sorry few have been imprisoned in inhumane conditions for walking through a building. This grievous insurrection, whose show trial no one is watching, involved one white woman being shot dead by a black police officer who appears to have fired indiscriminately through an internal window pane. The word woman is a cipher of controversy. Business as usual in the USA is the collapse of the product into propaganda. This centrism excludes the medium of reality itself, preferring a crafted and vigorously defended fairy tale to the chaotic and barbarizing realities emerging in an asset-stripped, normless pleasure island. In Britain, the shambles into which Boris Johnson's government has descended indicates a paucity not only of ideas, but of the capacity to have them. This week sees him announce that the war in Ukraine is due to toxic masculinity. This is a crisp case of regime propaganda. Firstly, it attaches emotions to a phrase, which results in positive feelings about the speaker and the target audience. The appeal is made to women, who are half the population and are likely to feel ungenerous to an adulterous philanderer. It is a means of boosting his personal ratings and also indicates the neutrality of managerial party machines. His is one which defends the right of women to kill their offspring, and together with other regime managers, has condemned the overturning of Roe v. Wade. Why is this an exemplar case of news management? It demonstrates the market research principle, where the manipulation of image is the only god. This is also the only thing our bureaucracies can still do well: spin events to recast themselves as heroes, the world villainous, whilst doing no good for anyone else. Johnson has survived only this long due to the lack of a singularly telegenic figure to replace him, since substance and moral integrity are irrelevant in the mass media age. What is required by the management is a news cyclist who falls less often. Over the water, the standard bearer for globalism has suffered a remarkable reversal in the French parliamentary elections. Macron, the self-styled Jupiter, or king of the gods, has lost 140 seats and his majority. The center is neither populist nor popular. This is the moment at which we are to entertain the idea of a major land war. It is obvious the regime is weak, frightened, and out of ideas. Mass immigration has not brought cohesion and prosperity in a new multicultural paradise. The vaunted Green Revolution has halted as the Germans and Austrians, Italians, and others turn back to coal to keep the lights on. The response to COVID was the end of any serious claim to liberal values. The billions printed have ruined our economies, on top of which are the devastating effects of the West having effectively sanctioned itself. It is staggering to discover that half the exorbitant price of our fuel is tax. The COVID policies, the Afghan withdrawal, the Ukraine gamut have all been disastrous. The management shuttered the economy to stop a virus that carried on being irrelevant regardless. The only idea they have left is one much loved by Tony Blair himself, that war is the civilizing duty of all moderates. They are desperate to appear relevant, decisive, dour, when in fact they have been so incompetent that their only remaining gamut is brinksmanship with Russia. The alternative to all-out war is unthinkable to them, which is to suffer yet another humiliating defeat. They will sacrifice any number of other people's lives to avoid losing the face that is their fortune. The law of the excluding middle. Centrism marginalizes ordinary voters, eclipsing their views with gesture politics aimed at playing well to a media which thrives on just this type of empty spectacle. It heads up headline-grabbing balloons inflated by an ever-postponed hope that something might finally be done. They send these up to excite their core voters who watch them vanish into thin air. Centrism is the art of manipulation. It concerns itself with grand international narratives, ignoring the decline and chaos at home, by focusing the discourse on bombastic initiatives which promise the earth but germinate the familiar corruption and disenchantment. It is careful to exclude from itself anyone who holds sincere convictions of the left or right. Marxist, socialist, patriotic traditionalists are largely an embarrassment to the feminized metrosexual urbanites of the middle ground, to whom principle is a handicap. And Frank Wright continues, the conservative government of Boris Johnson has lost seats in by-election. Its articles will appear bewailing the threat of a shift to the left, yet the Tories did not lose many votes to their opponents. They lost because their voters refused to vote for them. What this means is that the Conservative Party will lose power, and we are all supposed to care because they wear blue ties. The Labour Party will continue to disappoint its voters, itself being a Blairite vehicle, equally careful as the Tories to exclude anyone who actually believes in what it stands for. None of the Blairites vying for power will act to preserve your way of life. They are managers minding their own business, which is to look less bad than the other lot with whom they share their workplace. Eventually, as in France, voters tire of the charade. Macron took power by capitalizing on disaffection with the governments of the center-right of Sarkozy and that of Hollande of the center-left. Both of these parties have been reduced to irrelevant minorities, having once dominated French politics as the Tories and Labour do. Macron calls itself centrist populism as if it offered an alternative. In fact, it replaced two centrist parties with itself, broadly combining their supporters into one Blairite blob. After one term, the French have lost interest in this marketing campaign run by the typical centrist, a mediocrity who imagines himself a visionary. This man, married to his former school teacher, is by default the leading statesman of Europe, if not the West. Consider the competition. Macron's chance came once to exploit the electorate's exasperation with, if not hatred of, the business as usual nature of blue and red tie politics. His ideas were Blairite, the reform of society, the orientation to the globe and away from the nation. He had the same absence of leadership and principle as any Western leader whose policies in the pandemic have permanently weakened the states they used to enact them, fatally undermining trust in the institutions, handing printed billions to billionaires and pharmaceutical companies, and presiding over an inflationary crisis which may eclipse any other. The center has managed us into a post-liberal mess. The center cannot hold what it has, and all it has taken from us. That is the basis of the politics of the future, of the appeal to the broadest number of voters, and it is not being made on television, but in real life consequences. And he goes on to talk about Napoleon III, which was a kind of a populist Bonapartism. Napoleon III regarded himself as executing the will of the people, and he was quite broadly popular until the disaster at Sedan in the war with Prussia. Again, you can find this at frankwright.substack.com. And, oh yes, let's go back to Tainter. Yes, I've decided to skip to the end. Chapter 6, Summary and Implications. Message on a popular sign: every time history repeats itself, the price goes up. Collapse is recurrent in human history. It is global in its occurrence, and it affects the spectrum of societies from simple foragers to great empires. Collapse is a matter of considerable importance to every member of a complex society and seems to be of particular interest to many people today. Political decentralization has repercussions in economics, art, literature, and other cultural phenomena, but these are not its essence. Collapse is fundamentally a sudden, pronounced loss of an established level of socio-political complexity. A complex society that has collapsed is suddenly smaller, simpler, less stratified, and less socially differentiated. Specialization decreases and there is less centralized control. The flow of information drops, people trade and interact less, and there is overall lower coordination among individuals and groups. Economic activity drops to a commensurate level, while the arts and literature experience such a quantitative decline that a dark age often ensues. Population levels tend to drop, and for those who are left, the known world shrinks. Complex societies, such as states, are not a discrete stage in cultural evolution. Each society represents a point along a continuum from least to most complex. Complex forms of human organization have emerged comparatively recently and are an anomaly of history. Complexity and stratification are oddities when viewed from the full perspective of our history, and where present must be constantly reinforced. Leaders, parties, and governments need constantly to establish and maintain legitimacy. This effort must have a genuine material basis, which means that some level of responsiveness to a support population is necessary. Maintenance of legitimacy or investment in coercion require constant mobilization of resources. This is an unrelenting cost that any complex society must bear. Two major approaches to understanding the origin of the state are the conflict and integration schools. The former sees society as an arena of class conflict. The governing institutions of the state, in this view, arose out of economic stratification from the need to protect the interests of propertied classes. Integration theory suggests, in contrast, that governing institutions and other elements of complexity emerged out of society-wide needs in situations where it was necessary to centralize, coordinate, and direct disparate subgroups. Complexity, in this view, emerged as a process of adaptation. Both approaches have strong and weak points, and a synthesis of the two seems ultimately desirable. Integration theory is better able to account for distribution of the necessities of life, conflict theory for surpluses. There are definitely beneficial integrative advantages in the concentration of power and authority, but once established, the political realm becomes an increasingly powerful influence. In both views, though, the state is a problem solving organization emerging because of changed circumstances, differential economic success in the conflict view, management of society wide stresses in integration theory. In both approaches, legitimacy and the resource mobilization this requires are constant needs. Even though collapse has been a little understood process, this is not for lack of trying. Collapse theorists have taken to heart the Maoist dictum to let 100 schools of thought contend. While there is a nearly incomprehensible diversity of opinions regarding collapse, these seem to boil down to a limited number of themes. These themes suffer from a number of logical failings, so that none by itself is adequate. Mystical explanations seem worst in this regard, being virtually without scientific merit. Economic explanations are logically superior. They identify characteristics of society that make them liable to collapse, specify controlling mechanisms, and indicate causal change between controlling mechanism and observed outcome. Yet existing economic explanations offer no general approach that would allow the understanding of collapse as a global matter. Except for the mystical theme, no existing approach is necessarily incorrect. They are, as presently formulated, simply incomplete. And I'll have more from Tainter's The Collapse of Complex Societies on tomorrow's live stream. I'm going to talk a little bit. Yeah, okay. I have this problem with YouTube that, I save the URL of a YouTube video, and then I put in a Microsoft Word document, all the stories, the dozens of stories that I touch on, every show. And then I go to open it, and it's not there. It says your browser is up to date, which is not much useful to me. It's not of much use to me. I wanted to discuss a video by Anita Anand, who is Canada's defense minister, and she was appointed pretty much to preside over the destruction of what remains of the Canadian military. The number of sexual scandals in the Canadian military, which follow from an easily understandable reason: the integration of women into the military. So you got men and women serving side by side, and the men want to have sex with the women, and a lot of the women want to have sex with the men. Golly, you could have seen that coming. The Canadian press, in many ways Canada's Pravda, has a story by Mickey Jurich called "Survey Suggests Canadians' Stance on Free Speech is Swayed by Their Political Views." Shocker, I know. Respondents who lean right were more likely to believe there should be no limits on speech, including the right to express hateful and offensive opinions. The National Phone Survey by the Canadian Hub for Applied and Social Research at the University of Saskatchewan was done between June 1st and June 27th. It asked 1,000 people about their political leanings and their views on free speech. Research director Jason DeSano said he wanted to get a sense of where people stand on the matter, given the prominent role that the phrase freedom has been playing in the current Conservative Party of Canada leadership campaign. He said overall, 8 in 10 respondents, or nearly 86%, said they have or somewhat have freedom of speech. Most respondents also said they believe governments and corporations like Twitter and Meta should intervene to limit the spread of misinformation and hate speech. But when you break that down into one's political leanings, that's when you really see differences in Canadian views and opinions in the extent to which freedom of speech should be limited. About 1 in 4 of the respondents who lean right to very right believe Canadians have very little or no freedom of speech, compared to about 3% of left-leaning respondents who feel the same way. It's not surprising, says Barbara Perry, director of the Centre of Hate, Bias, and Extremism at Ontario Tech University. This woman is dragged out for pretty much every story of this kind. And what her message is that freedom it's not a Canadian concept. Canadians do not desire freedom because they understand that freedom is dangerous. Listen to what she has to say. If we look at the narrative over the past few years, there has been an emphasis on cancel culture. Free speech has become a rallying call for the far right. It's always been there, but I think it was really amplified by the emergence of the alt-right in particular. Boo, boo, the alt-right, which disappeared years ago. Perry said, so-called American free speech absolutism has emerged in Canada and can be linked to social media. We're not just talking about speech that's offensive or hurts someone's feelings. We're really talking about dangerous speech and speech that has the potential to do real harm. It comes back to the internet and having what they think is ease of access to spread whatever hateful and misguided ideas they want. The campaign has been going on for some time to soften Canadians up to the idea of them losing what little freedom of speech remains in this country. And, strangely, this story is not in mainstream media, but it is on Rebel News. Victoria Police, that's Victoria, British Columbia, have finally been forced to come clean and apologize to Rebel News that would be Victoria, Australia, Australia Bureau Chief Avi Yamini after unlawfully arresting him while reporting on several occasions. Yes, Victoria Police sincerely apologizes for this. You see, this fellow is not official media, so I guess he has no rights. But it's just, looking at National News Watch every day, I'm just really plunged into this bizarre fake world that the Canadian media lives in. I mentioned this woman and her personal problems last week because she made a rather alarming confession in the pages of Chatelaine magazine about her misery and how she got fat and covered with tattoos and cut her hair really short. Chelsea Nash, this is from the Hill Times. Canada needs to disaster-proof its relationship with the United States. Experts. Increasing political polarization in the United States has prompted some Canada-US expert observers to call for the Canadian government to prepare itself for worst-case scenarios south of the border. In the wake of the reversal of the landmark 1973 U.S. Supreme Court decision Roe v. Wade, as well as revelations of congressional hearings into events on Capitol Hill on January 6, 2021, some expert observers say Canada needs to disaster-proof its relationship with the United States in preparation for worsening political instability in that country in the future. Colin Robertson, a former Canadian diplomat and vice president and fellow at the Canadian Global Affairs Institute, said, the U.S. is not as reliable a partner as it was, or as we may have thought it was 10 years ago. We need to do some disaster proofing. What does that phrase mean? Oh, here's another expert. Sandy Hudson, co-founder of Black Lives Matter Canada, who is currently living in the U.S., but why are you living in the U.S. if it's such a horrible place and Canada's just so much nicer? She thinks it's more dire than that. I think that Canada should be preparing for an eventuality that nobody wants to see take place, but could take place, which is the eventuality of civil war. The reversal of Roe v. Wade came about after former President Donald Trump appointed 3 Supreme Court justices to the bench, creating a conservative majority. Oh, these are political decisions, said Hudson on the podcast she shares with fellow activist Nora Loreto. Yeah. But the big problem there, I think, is that it means more and more people are seeing that these are political decisions and refusing to believe that the law has any sort of objectivity, which I think is going to be a problem for the stability of the United States. She added in an episode titled, When the U.S. Falls, What Happens to Canada? For Canadian cultural commentator Stephen March, the Roe v. Wade decision has pushed the U.S. closer to a civil war. What makes these people think that Canada is not in the same or worse position than the United States? Just because the media never reports, there's no political dissidence allowed in the Canadian media. No, there isn't. Oh, look, there's occasionally some, procedural grumbles from these people, who are, what's the phrase? Fiscally conservative and socially liberal. Yeah, some procedural grumbles. Boy, those scandals out of the Trudeau government those clowns in Ottawa have done it again. You know, that's what it boils down to. Let's take a look at the chat. Canada would have to amp up its defense and security spending because it wouldn't be able to depend on America's protection. Who's going to invade Canada? The only conceivable threat to direct military threat to Canadian sovereignty comes from the United States. What is Russia going to come over the pole? Is that the idea? Is China going to come over the Pacific Ocean? Really? Let's look at the chat, as I say. Okay. Oh, we're talking about pre-Gen X band Chelsea, my trail of disgrace. USA is the last great hope for freedom, and we're fighting, says Don Willis. Laird Gordon McDoodle says, I have an uncanny ability of being able to understand what's going on through observation. No, Kevin, TRS yet lives, says Brian Frakes. Okay. Billy Idol got his start with Generation X, says Don Willis. How many versions of Dancing with Myself? Didn't it take it the third time around for that song to be a hit? I heard it in, a grocery store the other day. Very catchy tune. I find them interesting post-punk band, partly because of style, because they are Gen X and just getting attention. What do they get Mick Ronson to produce their record, did they? He was a good producer and arranger. Okay. After Kevin is done with Tainter, he will move on to the Victoria phone directory. Come on, y'all love Tainter. No, I'm going to move on to James Burnham's Suicide of the West. Let the starving jackals and hyenas go berserk over the rotten carrion in the world, says Ruslan Akhmetov. Yikes. Okay. Kevin seems overall more optimistic than Kato. Well, as Herbert Stein famously said, and there's many different versions of this, systems continue until they fail. The assumption that our current rotten, upside down system is just going to keep moving in the same direction forever. Oh yeah, by the way, no more food for you. What? No, we've decided you're going to live on grass and bugs, and we're going to pave over all the farmland. Yeah. Well, it could happen, I suppose. But what is too many people in Africa? Is that the idea? Africa is experiencing great food shortages now, and it's only going to get worse. Steve Saylor constantly talks about the most important graph in the world, African population going like this in this century. There's going to be a Malthusian die-off long before those numbers are reached. One of the reasons why is foreign aid. After, with Live Aid, we got to send food to the Africans. And so what happened was that farmers stopped growing food because you can't compete with free. And Africans used to be rather good at controlling their own fertility, but they'll pile into the cities now. And it's not going to end well. Talking about tennis, Rage Against the Machine. Yes, they're complaining about Roe v. Wade being overturned, refusing to use the word women. Refusing to use the word women. Looks like an 8-year return on investment on solar bank and batteries with a 10-year lifespan. That is with no hailstorms, and there are plenty of them here. I think Councillor talked me out of it. Richard Hell. He's still around. He kicked junk, I think, finally. I used to enjoy his film reviews. Yes. Old joke about Kamala Harris. Yes, Richard Hell was married to Patty Smythe. Not Patty Smith, but Patty Smythe, who who was briefly popular, in the 1970s. I want to talk about baseball a little bit here because I've been watching the Toronto Blue Jays, and they stink. They just, you know, well, we're halfway through the season, a little more than halfway through the season. They've won 1 out of their last 10 games. They're finding new ways to lose. For instance, the catcher, who's supposed to be a phenom, forgetting how to catch a towering fly ball, which was just a few feet from the plate. It's coming. Here it comes. Here it comes. Here it comes. Oh, there it goes. Outside my glove. But even better, this is from Matthew Nescius at the New York Post. The Toronto Blue Jays' abysmal road trip came to a fitting end in Sunday's loss to the Seattle Mariners, thanks in part to a bloop, a blast, and a broken glove. Things began to go awry in the 5th inning of the contest when Toronto held a 4-1 lead. After Sam Haggerty grounded the ball back to Blue Jays reliever David Phelps, the pitcher then fired the ball home for the second out of the inning. From there, catcher Gabriel Moreno delivered a strike to first base that would have quickly capped off the double play if only Vladimir Guerrero Jr.'s glove had cooperated. Moreno's heater instead shot straight through Guerrero's leather and onto the field. The first baseman could only look down at his mitt in disbelief as another Mariners run scored en route to a 6-5 win in a 4-game sweep. The 1 in a million play was all too familiar to Guerrero, who had to trash a glove earlier this season after a near identical event. When facing off against the Baltimore Orioles on June 13th, the 23-year-old attempted to catch a long throw from third baseman Santiago Espinal, only to see the ball whiz through the webbing of his mitt. Twice in one season. I'm at a loss to understand this. The Toronto Blue Jays he changed the glove after the first time it happened. The Toronto Blue Jays being supplied inferior, perhaps bootleg sporting equipment, or is Guerrero treating his glove in some peculiar fashion? I wanted to talk about Dominicans in baseball. There's an awful lot of Dominicans on the Toronto Blue Jays, including Vladimir Guerrero Jr. The manager of the Blue Jays is a man from Puerto Rico called Charlie Montoya. And one of the reasons that he was hired as the manager of Blue Jays, supposedly, is that he speaks Spanish. And there are so many players on the Toronto Blue Jays who speak Spanish. They sit all together. All the Spanish-speaking players sit together, and all the non-Spanish-speaking players sit separately. And a few years ago, I decided to test a hypothesis of mine. I think I set a limit of 4 or 5 Dominicans for a team. And I wondered if any World Series winners in the last 20 years had at least 4 or 5 Dominicans on the team. And I discovered that no, not one. And I think there's a reason for that. And the reason is that the team disunity that arises when teams are divided by this ethnic linguistic division between Dominicans versus everyone else. I noticed that, an attitude to these Dominican players, like even during this just, abysmal time for the Toronto Blue Jays, Vladimir Guerrero seems to be having a whale of a time. He should not be having a whale of a time. He should be miserable because the Jays on the field have looked as if they're not even trying to win or don't care. But no, they're yucking it up, that nonsense with the home run jacket. And I've noticed with the Blue Jays, perhaps more than any other team that I've seen, these celebrations on the field. This is bad sportsmanship. And okay, you scored a run or whatever, and okay, look at the score. Look at the score. Okay, if you're behind, 8-2, and there's a solo home run. So, it's in the seventh inning and you're behind 8-3. You might want to tone down, the yucks and the celebrations a little bit. And Montoyo, rather, I don't think he has command of these ball players. It's a bad situation. I mean, what was it? What did Guerrero do after hitting a fly ball? He ran out into the bullpen area and decided to spend some time there. So yeah, but I'm worried about Major League Baseball because again, these old rules against embarrassing and humiliating your opponent seem to be drifting away. We don't quite have touchdown dances or anything like that, but we're getting close to it, and I would hate for that to happen. And let's see what we have here. Okay. Morrissey, why do you come here? Don Willis. Saw them live opening for the Who at Shea Stadium and at Bonds Casino. Who would that be? Who would that be? Oh, The Clash? London's Burning and Career Opportunities are my faves, says Metal Mike. I think the English version of their first album was outstanding. One of the most exciting records ever made. Their obsession with politics got to be boring. Can you imagine putting out a triple album called Sandinista? I mean, come on. Did any of you ever see the movie, the Clash movie, Rude Boy? I saw it in the theater. I think there was about 4 people there. But there seemed to be all these different versions of it around. You got Joe Strummer wearing a Red Brigade t-shirt, and he seemed to have no idea who the Red Brigade actually were. Who's now married to John McEnroe was married to Tatum O'Neal, who is the daughter of Ryan O'Neal and the lovely Joanna Moore. She appears in a lot of 50s and 60s TV shows like Perry Mason and Alfred Hitchcock Presents. She's in this Alfred Hitchcock episode. It's quite clever. It's about a man who dies. Joanna Moore's husband dies of a heart attack, and he is buried in his best suit, but he's put the lottery ticket, the Irish sweepstakes, a winning ticket, $50,000, which would be worth about $1 million today. And she's married. She's got a new husband who seems kind of sketchy, and she gets the ticket back, but then it appears that her husband killed the first husband and has plans for Joanna Moore, who manages to avoid becoming a victim. It's just absolutely a gorgeous woman. Okay. Joanna Moore played James Caan's wife in Countdown, says Paul Cassaway 88. She had a sad life, Joanna Moore. Pretty much everyone associated with Ryan O'Neal, I think, has had a sad life, especially his children. She got hooked on, I think Ryan O'Neal left her after, 4 years marriage or something. She became hooked on pills and drugs, and her career rather disappears. Visionary Companion says in one scene in Rude Boy, Strummer tells the young man, "I've been watching you straighten up," or something like that, because the kid's something that was counter-revolutionary. Paper Moon is a delightful movie, says Anne Rund. Indeed, it is. The new unreleased Morrissey song about the Manchester Arena attack is very good, says Oscar Toe. Hello to Professor Paul. The Clash had a couple of good songs, but were political idiots like most musicians. Political idiots, in the same way as Rage Against the Machine, very, very boring. I find much of what Morrissey has to say on various subjects to be, I don't know, outrageous or enraging, but he is certainly not predictable. You can't accuse him of that. So, hang on just a second here. Okay. I'm going to talk about Jacques Ellul. And Jacques Ellul was a French, described by Wiki as a French philosopher, sociologist, lay theologian, and professor who was a noted Christian anarchist. He died. He lived from 1912 to 1994. There seems to be a revival of interest in him in recent years. Perhaps we'll get to see a revival of interest in Ivan Illich, who was also a fascinating thinker. But this is from a Substack called Seeking the Right Thing. And the essay is called The Anatomy of Politics, The Political Illusion by Jacques Ellul. Politics is its own sphere with its own rules. Trying to impose religion or morality onto the political is a recipe for lousy, ineffective politics. It is another reason why democracy is a bad idea. As Ellul opens this section, the necessary and the ephemeral, he accepts Machiavelli's argument that politics must be understood as its own autonomous category governed by its own rules. At its most basic, politics is about what is most effective and efficient. You must deal with the political realm as it is, not as we would like it to be. As a background, we see that Ellul, as a Christian, understands that the world is fundamentally flawed by human sinfulness, by humanity's inborn capacity for evil. The reality of evil and humanity's propensity to do what is evil must be faced head-on by Christians. He argues that in a world where there is evil, there are times one must do things that are necessary in order to deal with existing evil. Sometimes it is necessary to commit acts of violence. But this necessity does not make these acts good or moral or Christian. Ellul argued for a strict separation of the Christian from that of violence. Even though violence is necessary, it should not, nor can it be, justified by the saving work of Jesus. You commit violence knowing it is an unjustifiable evil act, but one that is necessary. For a fuller understanding, I invite you to read my piece on Ellul's book, Violence. I would argue that Ellul does something similar with the political realm. Politics is part of that which is necessary. As we will see later, he argues that a Christian politics will be impossible, hypocritical, and disastrous. Since Machiavelli, Ellul explains, the only criteria by which a state can be judged is its effectiveness. Once this is acknowledged, though, regardless of the form which the state takes, it renders all states essentially the same in practice. Whether a country is a republic, as a parliamentary system with a monarch, or is authoritarian, the only criterion which matters is the efficacy of the state. An effective authoritarian government is better than an ineffective system of democratic republicanism. You may feel morally superior living in an ineffective democratic regime, but that superiority is based on an illusion, a false judgment of the autonomous nature of politics. All moral conclusions about the particular form of the state are illusory. Once we recognize that politics is its own autonomous realm governed by its own rules, its own necessity, we can look at it properly with unclouded eyes. If we accepted the autonomy of politics, how do we judge the legitimacy of a state if we cannot do so on moral grounds? Ellul argues that all states are founded by force, by violence. There is no exceptions to this. A state gains legitimacy when it can defend itself from its neighbors. Quote, in the present world, the state is taken seriously only when it threatens or defends itself in a fight to the death against some grave danger to its existence. Carl Schmitt would approve. And again, from Ellul, we will find that powers which are able to maintain themselves are legitimate. There are two sources of legitimacy that must work together for a regime to secure and maintain its legitimacy. One, support by the people. Two, recognition by other states. In practice, though, because the first criteria can be and generally is manufactured through propaganda, the only actual marker of legitimacy is that the state is recognized as a state by other states. There are no moral criteria. The worst despots, once recognized, are legitimate. North Korea's state is as legitimate as that of the United States of America. The Taliban are legitimate because the US, through its actions, has recognized them as legitimate. Ellul argues that once the autonomy of politics is recognized, there is no longer any normative power to law. If the law collides with the facts on the ground, the law will be changed to conform with political realities. You can see the truth of this necessity when a state applies the use of force, of violence. The law is made to conform to the state's use of force. With this in mind, we must understand that the police and the military are the same. They are both applications of state force. Any differences are illusory. Both the military and the police apply force on behalf of the state. The law will not restrain the use of force by the government. The idea of the rule of law is a fiction, an illusion. The slightest manifestation of independence, specifically in the use of force, is a challenge to the state's monopoly on power. Hence the fixation on taking weapons out of the hands of the citizenry in every state all the time. Any and all reasons having to do with public safety are illusory. Citizens with weapons are an existential threat to the state. The citizen cannot be allowed to act to limit the power of the violence of the state. From the state's perspective, he is merely the object of the state's use of force, of violence. If a citizen challenges the force power of the state to limit its ability to use violence in any way, this immediately makes the citizen a partisan or a militant. Remember, the Second Amendment is not about hunting personal safety or preventing crime. It is meant as a restraint to state power, a constant implicit threat by the citizenry against the state's power to use violence. Quote, to state that the state should not employ force is to simply state that there should not be a state, unquote. The state, to be a state, must use violence against other countries, against its citizens. This is the necessity of statehood. A state cannot avoid war. We must understand that there are no rules to war. Such rules only prevent victory. The rules of war are only a valid thing during peacetime. The sole rule of war is to win. This is the same whether the enemy is external or internal. There are no rules. Laws are rewritten as necessary to justify the autonomous actions of the state. Ellul also makes the point that democracies are the easiest states to defeat in war because they are the states which are most likely to let scruples undermine the goal of winning. The soft rule of war is to win. The sole rule of war is to win. Even when the bullets are not flying and citizens are not being put in their place with physical violence, Ellul argues that this does not mean that the state is not maintaining its power through violence. Propaganda is a form of violence. It is psychological and spiritual warfare against the people to manufacture consent. The state operates in this autonomous realm of necessity in its use of force and violence. We judge this not in terms of morality, but rather in terms of its effectiveness. With this in mind, we have to understand that the bureaucracy, the technical administrative state, operates within this realm of autonomy. The only criterion that can be applied to it is that of effectiveness. The administrative state does not adhere to any morality. Quote, from the moment the state is bureaucratized, what norms of validity or legitimacy can impose themselves from the outside, unquote. Ellul argues that once we accept the autonomy of politics, we know that the bureaucracy is not and cannot be governed by moral or spiritual values. In fact, any state which organizes itself around material standards such as economics, that is applying the criteria of state effectiveness to the economy, accepts that spiritual and moral realities must be subordinated to the economic and the political. You are no longer free to pursue spiritual autonomy. Your choice is illusory. There can be no moral objections to the autonomy. The state is bound by nothing but its own necessity. Quote, we can establish as a basic principle that the more power grows, the more values disintegrate, unquote. For those that have read more widely in Ellul, the idea of effectiveness is the same criterion at the heart of the rise of technique in the modern world. There is this conjunction between technology, the market, and politics, pointing away from all other values, settling on the single value of effectiveness. We are just simply doing what works. That is the singular value of the autonomy of politics, enfolding within itself both technique and economics. Ellul argues that all other values that we might wish to apply to this autonomous system are meaningless, whether they are pre-modern Christian values and hierarchies, or they are modern enlightened values. They are all illusory when applied to the autonomous realm of politics, which runs by its own necessity. Quote, it is illusory to think that means of applying power must be increased so that justice, liberty, and the truth can be attained and realized. When the state has all power, no boundary remains between what is just and unjust, true and false, good and bad. The effective boundary is then between what can be done and what can't be done, unquote. Ellul argues that all modern states since Machiavelli are essentially the same. Whatever veneers are placed over the state are simply illusions to cover over the reality that they are autonomous and judged only by their effectiveness. Bringing this opening argument about the autonomy of the state to a close, Ellul makes the observation that rising standards of living, in fact, do not bring about greater political freedom. This is illusory. Remember, the material prosperity of the market is tied to the rise of the technical, the rise of the machine, and machine thinking. This approach to technical thinking, that is, scientific management, is applied universally across society in both the private and public sectors, growing bureaucracies everywhere. And with the increase of economic power came also the increase in technical power. As the ability to wield power increases in the economic realm, it also increases state power against the citizenry. With economic prosperity always comes a loss of power in the citizenry relative to the state. Quote, all theories to the effect that a rising standard of living will end in democratization and the limitation of the state are illusory, for there has never been any case of an effect diminution of the use of power, unquote. Power may shift from one group to another due to money, but power never decreases as wealth and prosperity increases. This highlights the stupidity of American foreign policy with regards to China from the outset. The growth in China's prosperity has only strengthened its state. It also shows the grave danger of globalization and the growing power of the globally wealthy. There's an excerpt from an essay, The Autonomy of Politics, the Political Illusion by Jacques Ellul, by a man who calls himself Epoch Coumarin, and his Substack is called Seeking the Hidden Thing. I'm going to take a final look at the chat. Hello, Ogan's Iron, who says right to bear arms used to be understood in many European countries, including France. What about the UK, though? How free were they firearms before Dunblane? Not so free. I mentioned the example of the hat pin on Friday. Oberyn Wall wrote about this, and this was before the Dunblane massacre. To repeat, in England, then and now, if you arm yourself with as much as a hat pin to protect yourself against, say, robbers or rapists, you have committed a crime. Popcasso 88 loves Sorcerer. Sorcerer is amazing. It is. It is. I never thought that I would see it re-released in my life, but it was. There was a question of who owned the rights. Okay. Who was in Blow Up? I like the film Blow Up very much. It's got that Sarah Miles in it. My word. They all laughed. That was a Peter Bogdanovich film, wasn't it? With Sybil Shepherd, I think. Was it? Oh, maybe not Sybil Shepherd. Bogdanovich's, he had a tough time with a lot of his films. You find Jane Birkin attractive? Asks Oscar Toe. I certainly do. She was considered the most beautiful woman in the world in the late 60s and early 70s. And, Bogdanovich had 3 big hits in a row, and then his career fell off a cliff, flop after flop. I don't know. Cherchez la femme. He was going to make a star out of Dorothy Stratton. He was, his real name wasn't used in Bob Fosse's movie Star 80. Bogdanovich is, half Serb, half Jew. The character that clearly based on him on Star 80 was given, I think, an Armenian name. Thank you for your kind words, Don Willis. Joe Strummer was the son of a British diplomat, LOL, says Jogakin 666. Yes, and he went to quite good, not top tier, but quite good private school. Okay. Ryan O'Neill was not well liked. He's still alive, isn't he? I think he is. Okay, I'm going to wrap it up here. Thank you so much for tuning in. Greatly appreciated, as always. I'll be back on the air tomorrow at 4 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Eastern. If you'd like to make a donation to the live stream, my PayPal account is linked to Kevin_Grace at hotmail.com. If you are in Canada, donations may be made directly to the live stream via Interac at kevingrace@shaw.ca. And I leave you with this. In these days of social atomization and civilizational collapse, I do dearly wish that you, my dear viewers and listeners, manage to forge a genuine human connection to ease the burden. Good night.